It was a firearm that didn't see action in either World War, but it served the nation for decades and belongs to a proud lineage of rifles still in use. Today, a short and convoluted history of the M1916 Spanish Mauser.
Hi there, Steve from Steve M Outdoors, and today we've got a short and convoluted history of the M1916 Spanish Mauser, a carbine which saw no action in either World War I or World War II, thanks to Spain's neutrality in both of those conflicts, but still has a pretty interesting history attached to it. So in order to tell you the history of the M1916, we actually have to go back in time a little bit to the 1890s with the Spanish acceptance into service of the Mauser model 1893. Commonly referred to as the Spanish Mauser, although other countries like the Ottoman Empire also adopted it. Now, the M1893 is largely based on the M1892 that Paul Mauser had developed for Spain's military, which was largely an iterative improvement over earlier rifles that he had been working on. To say that the M1893 was a great success would probably be an understatement for two reasons. First, the M1893 served as the model for future Mauser action rifles, which included the Gewehr 98, the rifle which, in one form or another, served Germany through 2 world wars, and one that many people consider to be the finest Mauser action rifle of the first half of the last century, if not perhaps the whole century. The second reason was Spain's use of the M1893 during the Spanish-American War of 1898. Now, although that 4-month conflict proved absolutely disastrous for Spain, leading to the loss of several of its remaining colonial possessions, the rifle they carried, the M1893, was far too superior to the Craig Jorgensen rifles of the United States. In one instance, such as at the Battle of San Juan Hill, the rifle held by 750 Spanish soldiers held off 8,500 American soldiers for an extended period, thanks in part to the large volume of fire that the M1893 was able to put out compared to the Craigs and the trapdoor Springfields of the Americans. That actually spurred the United States to develop a new rifle, which eventually was the M1903 Springfield, which was essentially a Mauser rifle. Now, I do have a video up of the history of the M1903 if you are interested. Now, the M1893 was a rifle of its era, to say that it was long and cumbersome, and it was based on the assumptions of the war of those days, and not a universal fit for soldiers, particularly the cavalry. In 1895, Spain adopted another rifle, the M1895 carbine, not to be confused with the M1895 rifle, which was a slightly improved version of the M1893, basically a shortened M1893. The Spanish went through a few other models of Mauser rifles, which we won't get into in this video, until 1916, when they adopted the M1916, the subject of today's video. Now, the M1916 was designed to replace the M1895 cavalry carbine, thanks to both improvements in the Mauser design and the relatively new M1913 cartridge, which was 7x57mm, what we today commonly refer to as the Spanish Mauser cartridge, which the 95 carbine was not optimized for. Now, the M1916 was able to be reloaded using stripper clips, and it featured gas escape holes to vent excess gases in case of cartridge failure. Now, the carbine has the same action as the M1893 rifle, but did have a turned down bolt handle, a rear tangent sight graduated to 2,000 meters, and a tapered front sight protected by ears. Now, it's a relatively short rifle with a barrel that measures about 21.75 inches. It weighs a svelte 6.5 pounds, and like its cousin, the M1893, it had an internal 5-round magazine. Standard amongst all Mauser rifles, it has this 3-position safety. It is a cock-on-close system, as you will see. as all Mausers up until 1895 had. But, and one of the reasons for the safety issues, it is a two-lug system. And as I said, all Mausers up until 1895 only had two lugs. The third rear locking lug that came later. The M1916 was manufactured by Fábrica de Armas from 1916 to 1951 and Industrias de Guerra de Catalunya from 1936 to 1939. All of these rifles that have been converted to 7.62 NATO have, as you can see here, cal 7.62 on the side of the receiver. This one is scrubbed. It doesn't have any Spanish markings. Now, if you recall the introduction of this video, I stated that the rifle never saw action in World War I or World War II, but it did see combat, and its greatest contribution to conflict may have been during the Spanish Civil War from 1936 to 1939. During that war, both sides, the Republicans and the Nationalists, armed themselves with whatever they could procure out of government arsenals, and a lot of those rifles were M1916s. According to one article in the M1916, and I'm going to read this, at the outbreak of war, both the M1893 and M1916 were standard issue. Spain had roughly 497,000 serviceable rifles on hand. Prior to the war, the leftist government feared a military coup. As a result, the army was only given enough rifles for routine things like guard duty and some training. The Spanish government stored the remaining rifles with their bolts removed, and then in turn stored those bolts in a separate location. This backfired spectacularly when the government decided to arm the Red Mob as a defense against the advancing fascist nationalists, and then realized they had no functioning weapons. Only about 10% of the rifles in the hands of the Reds had bolts. Needless to say, the fascists were able to quickly overrun the storage areas and seize many rifles and bolts, while the Reds struggled to arm themselves, chamber rounds effectively, and not have the rifles blow up in their faces when fired. And that's from Armed But Not Dangerous. Now, as history relates, Franco's forces were eventually victorious. Now, in 1943, many of the M1916s were then rechambered to 7.92 by 57mm Mauser, thanks in large part, well, exclusively to the introduction of the M43 rifle, which was essentially a Car 98K with some modifications. And the rifles were then relegated to second-line service with La Guardia Civil, kind of a combination of an American-style National Guard and a police force like France's Gendarmerie. Very much respected by Spaniards, the Guardia Civil was pretty much tasked with keeping peace and stability in the country after the formal, although sometimes not actual, end of the Civil War. Today, the Guardia Civil works alongside the Spanish military. You'll also find them on peacekeeping missions around the world. And if you're ever in rural Spain, you'll actually probably find them performing police duties. So at this point, most of these stories end with, and then the rifle was taken out of service. But the M1916 actually continued to serve afterwards, when in the 1950s, they and the remaining M1893s were rechambered to 7.62 by 51mm NATO, or what most people would know as .308 Winchester. In the early 1950s, the Spaniards were keen to join the semi-automatic world, so they began working on the rifle which would eventually become the SETME Model 58, one that through its development process didn't begin but ended up being chambered in the 7.62 NATO round. Rather than ditch these second-line rifles, it was probably cheaper to rechamber the 16s and the 93s to the new cartridge. I haven't been able to determine whether these rifles, the ones that were chambered in 8mm Mauser, were then chambered to 7.62 NATO. Depending on how you read some of the historical sources, there was probably some overlap, and some of the M1916s converted to 7.62 NATO were from 7mm Spanish Mauser. And so the rifle soldiered on, in a manner of speaking, for a few more decades until it was eventually removed from service and dumped on the surplus market, mostly in the 1980s. Today, it's not a particularly expensive or sought-after rifle, which is unfortunate because although they don't have that World War pedigree that a lot of people look for, they did see service in the Spanish Civil War and through decades of use with the Guardia Civil. So a question of safety. In recent decades, there have been questions about whether M1916s chambered in 7.62 NATO are actually safe to shoot. You hear any number of reasons for the doubt, whether .308 at Winchester is safe to use with a small ring Mauser, the quality of Spanish materials and metallurgy, the alleged difference between .308 Winchester and mil-spec 7.62 NATO, and whether two locking lugs, as you saw earlier, were strong enough for the more powerful round. If you do some research on this question, do some research of the question on the internet, get a cup of coffee and a lot of time because you're going to be going down a rabbit hole. Now, according to a September 1987 Guns and Ammo article where they actually tested the M1916 with .308 Winchester, and you'll see this on the screen as I read it. As mentioned earlier, the current batch of Spanish Mausers has been chambered for .308. As there was some concern about the gun's safety, the importer, Samco Enterprises Incorporated, sent some of these rifles to the respected H.P. White Laboratory Incorporated for a thorough going over. White put some pretty hefty loads through the test guns, successfully running pressures in excess of the SAMI max of 55,200 psi for .308 Winchester. In fact, the guns were tested to destruction only after exceeding 98,000 pounds per square inch. So my take, these rifles were imported by the thousands in the 1980s and afterwards, and I've never found any first-person accounts of these rifles detonating in someone's face while shooting them with .308 Winchester. Every story seems to be a variation of, I read about the internet about this guy. Yes, the recoil is stout. 7.62 NATO has some kick in lighter rifles, but the evidence for these rifles being dangerous seems non-existent at this point. Now, if you are concerned, I would recommend using mil-spec 7.62 NATO, or if you reload, go towards the lighter end of load data. Either way, concerns about safety seems to be an internet myth, because I don't think there's anything to it. So are the rifles worth owning? Unless there's something unique about a firearm, collectors tend to gravitate towards rifles which saw combat service in their lifetimes. World War combat service, often, leaving the M1916 Spanish Mauser carbine to be an afterthought, leaving them mostly for Mauser collectors who have to have every Mauser from every country. That's unfortunate because the M1916, although it doesn't have the glorious World War service that other rifles do, did play an important role in both the development and evolution of Mauser rifles and in the history of Spain. Now, in my mind, it may not have the cachet of other Mauser rifles like the Kar98K or even the M1893 that it's based on, but I think the M1916 Spanish Mauser should be in the collection of someone who appreciates the history of this fine rifle. And the bonuses are that it's still relatively expensive, and mil-spec 7.62 NATO can be found on most store shelves. Anyway, that's it. As always, I hope you found the video interesting and informative. If so, please feel free to give it a like and share it. If you have any comments, please feel free to leave them below. That's very much appreciated, and I always respond to all comments. You can also subscribe to the channel for future content like this, and also fishing, hunting, shooting, whatever. Below in the description, you'll find links to both my Twitter and Facebook pages. May your shots ring true, and hope you have a great day.